All right, colleagues, good day. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to look at the importance of mother language. This webinar actually was supposed to take place on the 21st of February, which is the International Day of Celebration of mother language, but we could not have it on that time because of other commitments. However, we are doing it today, notwithstanding nothing changes, and we have our two guest speakers that are with us this afternoon. Dr. Jalwo received his PhD from the University of Toronto and was awarded Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Fellowship for his research entitled Culturally Relevant Education for Minority and Rural Village in Asia. He has taught for over a decade as a faculty member at the Department of Tibetan Language and Culture, the Northwest University for Nationalities. Recently, he was appointed as a prioritized full professor of the Institute for Studies in Education at the Yunnan Normal University. His research interests cover educational sociology, the structuration theory-based new sociology of education, Tibetan Buddhism in society, mother tongue and its policy, indigenous knowledge in curriculum, social, cultural reproduction, sociological studies of spirituality, and multilingualism. He is the author of the Lexington book, Social Structuration in Tibetan Society, Education, Society, and Spirituality. And our second guest speaker is Mrs. Charlotte Namolani. She is a PhD candidate in linguistics from University of Limpopo here in South Africa. She is a temporary lecturer in linguistics at University of Limpopo. She is also a freelance language practitioner offering language services such as transcription, translation, interpreting, proofreading, and editing. She loves anything that has to do with language, and she is planning to enroll for postdoctoral studies after completing her PhD. Colleagues, from the short bio that we have read from our speakers, I want to assure us that there are no better individuals that we will have hosted this afternoon other than Dr. Jalwo and Miss Charlotte Namolani. Now, before I introduce the order of speaking and probably what will happen after, I would like to invite Mr. Ngodu Doje from the Office of Tibet to give us an opening remark. Ngodu, please.
Okay, Arta, thank you so much for your moderating this webinar. And I would like to say greetings to all the participants who are here right now, and also many who are listening and watching this webinar on the Tibettv Facebook Live. It is indeed a very great pleasure to organize this webinar, which the importance of mother language-based education and all over the education. That is, and the 21st February, we wanted to organize this on 21st of February because that is the International Mother Language Day. But because 21st February is the Tibetan Losar, so we had to postpone it for this date. But we are indeed very happy to organize this. And this is one of the very, very relevant topic that we feel it is in our heart that we must speak this on this topic because this is a very, very generic problem, or you can say relevant for the education of the hundreds and millions of children all over the world, especially in Africa and in the Tibet region, because this is in the recent time, the Chinese government have introduced so-called bilingualism education in the name of, but the whole purpose, the crux of that policy is to really, the Mandarin education has been throttled down on the Tibetan children. So at the moment, I think almost 2 million Tibetan children are really enrolled into a sort of a boarding school where they are only given the education in the Mandarin from even the preschool level to the senior school. That is one of the tragic part, because and that process actually the children are uprooted from their culture, language, and their own sort of altered. Because I've also gone through this experience. Because when the Tibetan came in 1959 from Tibet, we were put into school where the English was a medium of education. And see, I know that after class 5, I didn't understand anything. There was a lesson being taught, science and social science, mathematics, but there's no any real comprehension because the language is different. You don't understand it, And the teacher who teaches that also don't speak Tibetan language. So that was a big, I feel, when I reflect back, a big waste of time of my life, when I should be really learning. And I also think that why there is the competency of the Tibetan children in the mathematics and science is still weak, is I think they are not taught in their own mother tongue. So the comprehension is very less. So I think I will not go into this, but it is a research proven, and that the children, at least in the primary level, must be given an education in their mother tongue, so better comprehension, a better sort of acculturation, better respect for their own culture and identity. So this whole purpose is, I think, we want to highlight that. And thank you so much for this. And I also acknowledge the presence of former President, His Excellency Ilan Kama here for really joining us. And I would like to thank you so much for your support to this webinar. Thank you so much, Ada.
Thank you so much, Ngodupla. The issue of language is very critical, especially for us in the African context, because 2 weeks ago, I was speaking in a panel at the University of Pretoria on knowledge production and pedagogy in African university spaces. And of course, there is a key argument that was presented by one of Africa's organic scholar by the name of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who argues that the language choice in any multilingual space creates a form of language hierarchy, because language choosing or any choice of language enhance the ability in which people see the world that is driven in front of them. So this issue of language is very critical. And that is why decoloniality in Africa looks into the area of language as strong as ever, because language actually enhances and reinforces the notion not only of identity and culture, but the determination to have a place in the global metric. However, I'm going to invite Dr. Giallo from the context of the concept note. Dr. Giallo will give us, Elizabeth, please, maybe you should turn off your camera because I think it's interfering with the images. So Dr. Giallo will give us a 15-minute presentation from the context of the concept note. The reason I'm inviting Dr. Giallo first is because of academic seniority. that we will listen to Dr. Giallo. But however, when Ms. Charlotte intervened, I will let her bring Dr. Giallo back, because most of us, except probably Ms. Charlotte, we've been following the issues that are unfolding in the context of the Tibetan situation, where they find themselves today in the global setting critically. And beside what we are doing, we want to echo that dynamics of what is happening with the Tibetan people. Dr. Giallo, if there's anything you want to add about yourself that I did not say, please feel free to mention. The room is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And it's I think the mother tongue issue is now it's a timely significant to address in our weaker social group in the international context. We can see it. Everyone speaks one form of the language that they inherited from their mother. That's not. It's not just a simple inheritance. It contains way of the life. It contains a way of the thinking. It contains the way of the towards a value system. How you see the world. The mother tongue is at a sociological level. It is a irreplaceable element of the social constitution. Language and the culture is a two sides of a coin for the society, for the identity. The mother tongue also is a key element in for developing the cognitive. There's no other good way to avoid throughout the language to develop the cognitive. This is a important aspect of the language and the mother tongue. Then, based on this, from this, I can share some my PowerPoint. We can see all together. I'm going to talk about the global perspective on bilingual education model, and then the interdisciplinary perspective on the model of the bilingual education, mental overlap view of the bilingualism, model of bilingualism and education, language and education model, and the effective models, and the models for success for students' identity types, and one proposed ideal approach to first language-based multilingual education. Finally, going to be a conclusion. So, based on the global perspective on the bilingual education model, the North American model, bilingual education model, European bilingual education model, New Zealand's minority education, China's bilingual education model. So when we comprehend all those model and the perspective, then we know where is our position of the learning mother tongue. North America, for example, the US, the experience of the US multicultural fusion, and then Canada's coexistence of the multicultural, and Europe had a good model, for example, mother tongue-based bilingual education and a well-balanced bilingual education. There are two types of bilingual education. The New Zealand, the mainstream approach to support the indigenous people and the minority education, the so-called language nest. Language nest. That's a good idea, I think, in order to support the indigenous people and the minority people to learn their mother tongue. And then down here in China's bilingual education model, from the China's colonial ideology, they have a diversity in unity. Bilingual education in mainstream context of Chinese and English, they are lacking the theory of the second language learning and its research on the practice. Second, the two bilingual education model in minority context. This is completely lacking systematic research on the theory and its practice. For example, in Tibet, they have a Tibetan-based, language-based bilingual education and a Chinese-based bilingual education. The two models, the problem with the two models is the same, sharing the same content from the Chinese textbook. They call this bilingual education, but I reject this. This is a serious misleading of the bilingual education concept. Bilingual education should be teaching the two different language and culture to the students, not with the same content to teach the through the different language to the same student. Two bilingual education model in minority context, it's a serious problem. That's why I defined their education, bilingual education, it's not a real bilingual education, and also it's a colonial education. The chaos with the notion of the minority education until the 70 years past, they still have no clear, commonly agreed definition of the minority education. This in China, I think in our panel speaker, we have a scholar who from Africa, so I don't need to address this. So let me skip. And the language, the ideology, the decolonization and the colonizer have a different view on the language learning. One says one language, one way to go until to support the whole life. The other one is, okay, at the same time, you learning this first, learning this second, then they came out notion of the first language and second language, by which one learned by the first. Then there's another concept. This concept, I think, still on the in the academic community, we still arguing about this. What's the common underlying language proficiency? They add this language one and the language two. So what I think at the basic level, in the cognitive level, you realize, you understand the outside world as a fundamental basis. Then it can be expressed two different languages or many different languages. As for example, myself, I speak 3 languages. I can express my understanding of the culture and the world in 3 different languages. This is still arguing. So there are monolingualism as a norm, and the subtractive bilingualism and additive bilingualism. For example, in Tibet, this kind of a situation, it's only, there's no other languages, only Tibetan speaking content. The China penetrating their language by breaking those social contact. For example, this is the pure Tibetan social and linguistic contact. There's no other way, other language can be penetrated. So the language education model around the world, they conceive the many framework or concept. For example, then mother tongue support the dominant language submersion, and the second language instruction, and the weak bilingual education. Now in Africa, I think in China, on the minority and a weaker group, we're facing this weak bilingual education. For example, in China, they constrict the bar of the level of the bar. how much we allow you to learn. For example, from primary language to the secondary discourse, primary language discourse to secondary discourse. So strong bilingual education, that's a design of the mainstream contact. I think we need the demand this for our indigenous people and in Africa and the minority people in China. I'm gonna skip this English, I think. And then model for succeeded. Cognitive development is mediated via language. Second, if school instruction in unfamiliar language, then the less they lose the students' interest first, and then the less learning of the curriculum, the weak foundation for the later learning, weak development of the mother tongue, literacy, and especially formal and academic language. Subtractive learning, the second language, and academic language inadequately learned due to the above 3 points. Model strong bilingual instruction. That I think it's possible. Maybe a century years ago it's impossible, but now it's possible. By the supplementing the technology, we can learn. Indigenous people and the minority people around the world can learn their mother tongue well. At the same time, can learn the mainstream language well. This is, I think, it's a good hopeful model. This is for student identity type. Type one is a space traveler, and the second is a type 2 investor. One is a migrant. For example, people who migrate many all over the place with their parents, and then they learn where they're located. The West, the people who actually they want invest the money, capital to support learning more language, because one language and one world, it has an advantage. So type 3 is a dreamer, type 4 is a stuck. And then this is the one scholar who proposed for the bilingual education, how we build the mother tongue first, and then gradually increase the second language while having the strong mother tongue basis. So one of the sociology of the language scholar, who the fisherman, who said family as the smallest social linguistic domain is extremely important, but it seems that little research has been done. Fisherman in 1991 argued that without the intergenerational mother tongue transmission, no language maintenance is possible. So therefore, for the conclusion, I can say this: for Tibet, inside Tibet, 90% of the population lives in a village. It is a fundamental ground to develop Tibetan society, and all social improvement possibilities are strongly connected to the villager's perspective. If Tibetan village change radically, then there is nothing left for future of Tibet. China and the world will lose the crucial components of the cultural diversity. The Tibetan village need a culturally relevant, sustainable education, should be based on the democratic participation of the villager, should be acceptable to Tibetan and the Chinese government stakeholders. Revitalizing Tibetan language in the educational sphere can prevent shrinking of the language function of the Tibetan and its revival in cultural instruction. That's why I see the village is the key to maintaining and revitalizing the Tibetan language. So thanks very much. I can stop here.
All right, Dr. Giallo, thank you so very much. Colleagues, before we move to Dr.to-be Ms. Charlotte, I would like to present few honorable individuals that are joining us President Yen Kama, who is also participating in this webinar. Colleagues, President Kama is one of Africa's best ever leader. He was the former president of the Republic of Botswana, a man that raised living standard and the well-being of Botswana to a very great level. A leader that is very honorable, whom after 2 terms of office decide to take his retirement. President, we are forever grateful for your support for the people of Tibet. We have Ms. Kathleen Hosey, who works at the US Embassy. Kathleen, we acknowledge your presence. We thank you for your continuous support. Dr. Toby Nwachuku, who is somewhere in one of the universities in Taipei, in Taiwan, just as a visiting scholar. Dr. Toby, we will not talk much about you because time is against us. Ms. Charlotte, please, you will then take us to the significance of mother tongue, mother language in the African context. It's what we've been dealing with, like I said. Some scholars are, of course, arguing that our entire economic miracle as Africans is based on the transformation of a language. And others have even brought in Kiswahili as an attempted project that Africans can, embrace. But however, Kiswahili is a makeshift language. It's a language that is still very underdeveloped. So you will tell us basically how this navigate and present itself in Africa and your experience as a linguist. The room is yours, Ms. Charlotte. Thank you. Are you there, Ms. Charlotte? Hello? Colleagues, we are still waiting for Ms. Charlotte, with webinars and virtual spaces. Charlotte?
Unmute yourself.
Can you unmute yourself, please? Okay, maybe I should just prompt Dr. Giallo while we wait for Ms. Charlotte. I'm not sure what's happening, but we are used to having such interruptions on virtual spaces. Dr. Giallo, if you are still online, you don't mind that I may probe you 1 or 2 questions? Is it fine?
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, actually, you said a lot of interesting things, and one of the things that you mentioned was how China is breaking in, I speak in inverted commas, how China is breaking the social contacts among Tibetans. And the problem question that I want to ask is, what will be the end goal of that? If you may just give a little more emphasis.
There are 3 ways that China using the bilingual education system to decreasing the population to learn mother tongue well. For example, they restrict the curriculum, they control the curriculum. We are controlling how much you can learn, how much you cannot learn. The certain idea to set up behind the policy as a hidden policy there. So this is entirely over the last 30, 70 years, our 4th generation got the fit neither Chinese society nor Tibetan society. It's completely alienated those 4 generations by having those bad bilingual education system. First,
All right.
our society now, I think throughout my research, I can categorize this linguistic contact in 3 types. Strong mother tongue contact, or bilingual, oral bilingual social contact, pure Tibetan oral social contact, and pure little Tibetan and both Chinese written and oral language social contact. Those social contact producing the more generation in more diverse way. So this is a consequence of those misleaded bilingual education school system. And on the other hand, the mother tongue be removed from the authority system. Although China calls autonomous region and a 10 Tibetan autonomous prefecture and 2 counties. There recently, it is very clear. You don't see any Tibetan words in the government system, governing system. So it's our language, the Tibetan language, from becoming a secondary or disappearing from their native land.
Thank you, Dr. Giallo. We understand the issue of Tibetan language genocide. However, I'm going to come back to probe you further, but let's welcome Ms. Charlotte Namolane, who is going to take us into the African context of mother tongue, mother language. Charlotte, please.
Thank you so much, girls. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Tibet organizers and the management of this webinar. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Now I'll be taking you through the importance of mother language-based education, looking at the African context. Let me start by saying there is this saying from Nelson Mandela, which stipulates that if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. And if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And when I'm looking at this quote, his language actually refers to the mother tongue, meaning that the mother language is very important. It's very imperative in all the domains. Now, what is this mother language to start with? This is the first language one learns as a baby, the language one grows up knowing, which is also known as a native language. It is very important, not in only daily communication, however, also in education. Mother language education is important due to the following reasons. When we're looking at the education sector, when learners and educators use mother language to acquire education, it contributes largely to the growth of such language. Since this initiative promotes the provision of resources, such as funding, books, electronic technology, and infrastructure. Another thing about the mother language education is that it gives learners a strong sense of identity. If a learner is rooted very well in the mother language, they know how to identify themselves. They also know how to take pride in such in that language, and they can also, freely express themselves in that language. They gain confidence when they are native or proficient in the mother language. Again, mother language has been proven, especially in the years of a child's education, to be more effective in the educational process than the use of some other languages. A mother language develops a strong foundation for learning additional languages, meaning that if a child has a basic knowledge or is highly indebted in mother language, is highly knowledgeable in mother language, that child develops a strong foundation to learn other languages. It becomes easier for a child to learn other languages if that child understands their mother tongue. Again, when a child reads out in their mother tongue, they will have stronger literacy skills. If a child can read and write in their own mother language, they can also excel in other languages and as well as other subjects, looking at the academic performance. Okay, lastly, the importance of this language, the mother language education, it develops better connection with culture. Remember, you cannot separate language from culture. A language is a vital tool in society that goes in hand with culture. Languages are the greatest significant way of keeping our culture alive. Without language, without this mother tongue, I think one cannot know what are they really coming from, the roots of their culture. So it is through these languages that they benefit us to stay associated to our culture and our roots. Now, I want to share something here. It's about the languages of teaching and learning in the world, as well as a sample of teaching and learning in Africa. Let me share this. I want to share a synopsis that shows the current status of the uses of language for learning.
You want to share it? Is it some sort of PowerPoint?
Yes, it is.
Jigme, if you are there, please, could you assist her to display the PowerPoint?
It is. I'm going to share the screen.
Okay, we see it.
Is it really clear?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. Let me start here. Yes, the first figure here is it's a synopsis of languages of teaching and learning in the world. This table here clearly indicates the use of mother languages, or I mean the languages that are being used for learning and teaching in the world. The first language here, looking in the not really in the African continent only, but the world, some countries of the world. USA, you can see that the language that they use for language of learning and teaching is English. Canada, they are using English and French. Britain is English, Italy, Italian. France, it's French, and then Spain, they're using Spanish. Netherlands is English. Norway, Norwegian. Greece, it's Greek, and Iceland, they're using Icelandic. Japan, it's Japanese. South Korea, they're using Korean. And in China, it's Chinese. When I was looking at this table here, I realized that there's really something better about China. Although I do not have a great, Tibet background, but I think today I'll learn more about this Tibet. I realized something about China, that they are far better as compared to these African countries, like my country, South Africa. We're still having a problem. This English language and Afrikaans, they still dominate in various spheres of education. In universities, most of the languages that are still being used as English. In all the schools that you can check, English is being given the status to be, the language of medium of instruction. But in China, there are languages that are being used, such as Mandarin. However, in our country, we are not using Sepedi as a medium of instruction, nor Xitsonga or any other language. Now, I would like us to move again to the African continent. We're still on the sample of languages of teaching and learning in Africa now. When we look at Botswana, language of learning and teaching, they're using English, Ghana, English, Kenya, English, Nigeria, English, Uganda, English, Cameroon is English and French, Senegal is French, South Africa, as I said, it's English and Afrikaans, Zimbabwe, English. And now the question is, since there are indigenous languages from these African countries, why are they not being used as languages of learning and teaching? Do you see how or where do we experience language death? Because one of the ways in which a language grows, it is when that language is being used as a language of learning and teaching. If a child can learn, read, write, using their mother tongue, in that way, we are preserving language, because they will also be interested in communicating outside the education sphere using that language. Okay. Can I move along, Mr. Gallas?
Yes, please. You still have some time.
Okay, as I've touched on the importance of mother language education and also indicated the status of the languages of learning and teaching around the world and the African continent. Now I'd like to go straight to the recommendations or the ways in which these languages can be preserved. How can we promote mother language-based education? Because it is through this mother language-based education that these languages can be saved. Now, WOLF 2018 postulates that research has made it explicitly clear that if efficiency of language learning and cognitive development is the target, the mother tongue should be the medium of instruction from primary school through secondary schools and into universities. It should start from the lower level, the middle, up to the higher level. And then other languages like English can be introduced as subjects from lower primary level. Because as I said, mother language enables a child to effectively learn other languages. It is through the full knowledge of the mother tongue that can enable a child to additive bilingualism or multilingualism. And then again, these peoples or the learners should begin their schooling through the medium of mother tongue, meaning at the early childhood level. This language should start at an early childhood level education because they understand it better and because to begin their school life in the mother tongue will make the break between the home and the school as small as possible. Because one thing is that if a child also learns a language that we are speaking in home at school, that also makes the child to be interested in that language because they know that, okay, if I'm using Shona or Sepedi in home and also being taught in that language, that makes the child to excel in that language. And also that makes that child to promote that language wherever they go. Again, it is also fashionable, of course, to argue that African languages lack the required terminology. And that is true. These languages, they lack terminology. And of which this point, it can be the point that one would say, I'm not interested in this language because there are no equivalents in this language. Whatever that English is posing to us, in some cases we find ourselves not having, the equivalent terms to express the meaning in which English is posing to us. Now, that should not be an excuse of not promoting these languages because they lack that terminology, the scientific terminology. Actually, this seems to be a delaying pretext or tactic. If such an argument were to be entertained, then African languages will never be developed to such an extent that they will be deemed adequate or enough or sufficient to offer the aforementioned subjects. Now, the solution is to develop programs in higher education that utilize African languages as languages of learning and teaching. Okay, I'm still moving along to the recommendations. I'm not done. Looking at the abstract that you have sent me from Tibet, it also touched upon, perhaps the policies that can come in handy in preserving these languages. Now, I've touched on a few policies that can be used in preservation of these languages. The first one here, I've touched upon the language in education policy, which is based on the principle of additive bilingualism, meaning that this policy, it promotes, it encourages the use of more than one language. A child cannot only be taught in English or Afrikaans. Additive bilingualism promotes the maintenance of home languages, meaning that home languages should be used as well in education. Now, the home language is therefore not dropped in favor of another languages, according to this policy, but they are maintained together with the additional languages. The commitment to multilingualism in this policy is also reflected in the norms and standards regarding language policy, in which school governing bodies, remember in schools, lower in primary and secondary, we have what we call SGBs, the school governing bodies. Now, this policy also maintains that those SGBs, those bodies, are required to stipulate how their schools are planning to promote multilingualism. Now, it means the promotion again about these languages also lies in the schools. The SGBs, it is their duty as well to make sure or to come up with ways on how to promote these languages or to promote mother language education, how to make those kids be interested in learning these languages. Okay, and again, they can do this through using more than one language of learning and by offering additional languages as fully fledged subjects. Still on the policies, I wanna touch on, okay. I wanna talk about the Constitution again, the Constitution of South Africa, Act 108 of 1996. Our Constitution has declared that we have 11 official languages, but as I'm looking in our context, in South African context, English and Africans are just still dominating, not the African languages. This Constitution has declared that all those languages, all the 11 languages, not only 2, they should be used since they are given an official status to be used in education and other domains. However, that is still not the case. Consistency in legislation is a crucial aspect of the conditions that promote language growth, meaning that our government needs to be really consistent in the policies that they are compiling, because the Constitution on itself, it says that everyone has the right to receive education in the official language or the languages of their choice. But when you go to those schools or the universities, they are not receiving that education in the languages of their choice. There's so-called a medium of instruction, a certain language that has been chosen to teach. So you see, if that medium of instruction is always English, now what about other African languages? Because if these students or learners are not being taught or are not being, they are not exercising that right, as the Constitution has stated, to use the language of their choice, what will save that language?
Are you still with us, Charlotte? I think the internet connection at Charlotte's end poses a challenge now. However, one of the issue that I have gathered from the Tibetan and the African experience is this outcry of promoting multiple languages, the use of multiple languages, of course. Colleagues, please permit me to invite His Excellency President Jan Kama to throw light, shed light on some thought regarding the issue of language, because this actually is a very complex issue in the sense that at the end of the day, there is what I describe as the economy of languages when it has to do with exoglossic, which we call European languages, and endoglossic, African native languages. So President Kama, please, the room is yours. You may throw some thought, some light in what you have in mind. Thank you. Okay, Charlotte.
I'm sorry, I had a connectivity issue.
No, we understand. We understand you had connectivity. If you may just take 1 minute to round up, then we invite President Kama. Then we will come and probe you. Is that fine?
Okay, now it's fine. As I was wrapping up the presentation, I'm saying, critics will frequently opine that there's been little to no action. There hasn't been anything done about this, topic or the challenge that we have in the preservation of these languages. Only a lot of discussion. However, it is encouraging. It is so encouraging, especially looking in the African continent. South Africa per se that recently, despite what seems like unmanageable obstacles, the use of African languages in schools and universities is starting to be materialized, and it's no longer a mirage. African languages are gradually beginning to take their proper position in South Africa with the help of the government and organizations like the Basic Education and PenSouth. There's the PenSouth African Language Board. And if there is a consistency from these, organizations, it is clear without a doubt that we will make a significant progress if whatever that is being stipulated in the policies, it's been adhered to. Thank you.
All right, Charlotte, thank you so much. Apparently, the issue of language is a very complex issue, especially like I was saying, when it has to do with the economy of languages. I mean, exoglossic versus endoglossic languages, and exactly where Africa finds itself in this global space. However, before I bring you back, there is something, Charlotte, that you just need to ponder a little bit on. To learn, it talks about the essence of modern language and how can these languages be preserved when a lot of African countries have been colonized? That's something that Tulani, wants you to chip in a few words regarding that. We would like to invite President Kama. President Kama, are you on?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Excellent.
Good, good. There are just two issues I'd like to bring up and to put them into context. There's the issue of Tibet, and then what goes on in Africa. Someone earlier, I think, accurately described the situation in China and how it relates to the Tibetan language by calling it the Tibetan language genocide. Because when you have a state actor, in this case, the Communist Party of China, who deliberately want to dissolve and remove at all costs any sense of identity by the Tibetan people, they will resort as a policy to engage in the kind of actions that we have heard described against the Tibetan people and other cultures and peoples or nations within their borders. So that is one issue. I think everyone recognizes and realizes that when you talk about language, we're talking about identity and we're talking about the ability to communicate. And in China, that's what they want to erode, that if you're going to communicate, you only communicate through one, preferably in their thinking, in one language, or the languages that they would decide. And that is a reflection of the kind of system that they have, which is out of step with international best practice. Now, when it comes to Africa, and I heard made reference to Botswana, where I come from and where I was president of, we had a different challenge. Botswana is a population of just over 2 million people. And what we do, for example, we do have a number of different languages spoken by different tribes in the country. But you have a situation whereby in a village, in a rural village in the country, you could have 3 different tribes living in that village, each one speaking its own language, but only one school. So when you have one school, and then you say, fine, in that school, it has to teach the mother tongue of every child living in that village. It then becomes very complicated because then you've got to find teachers. You're going to have classrooms, for example, which are only for certain tribal groupings. And when you know in the African context, as much as we know there are tribes within the boundaries of a single nation, in order to, as much as we want to have national unity, and you want to recognize people have different cultures and different languages, you don't want to perpetuate or to bring out tribal divisions again through language. So you could have a situation whereby in a primary school, in that village I have just described, with 3 different tribal groupings, you're going to have a classroom for this tribe, a classroom for this tribe, a classroom for another tribe, because you've got 3 different tribes in the same village, in the same school. On top of that, you then got to have teachers who would be able to teach in those languages. And that means because some of the languages are only what you call it, peculiar to Botswana, you then have got to develop a curriculum in each of those languages, which have to be taught by teachers. And in Botswana, what happens is that a teacher can be transferred you know, for example, we have the teacher training colleges, which I'm sure is there in every country. And teachers are taught, they're going through the curriculum for primary education, secondary education, and what have you. And then when a teacher qualifies, they can be sent to any school in any part of the country. And that is what we look on as nation building. That you don't just say, no, you're a teacher from the eastern part of the country, you're stuck there. You can't go and teach anywhere else because the language you speak is only spoken in the East. So for the purposes of nation building, you want to be able to transfer people anywhere in the country, no matter where they come from or which tribe or grouping they belong to. So that was the challenge that I would like to say why it's not that easy. Like even when our sister was talking about the South African context in the universities where they only teach in English. But then they have 11, according to the Constitution, national languages. That would mean a particular class that would teach in physics, or a class that teaches in accounting, or a class that does nursing. If you have in one class people from different tribal groupings who have only been brought up to fully understand their own home language. And then you have to develop within the curriculum the technology or the technical expressions that would be needed to be able to compete in a globalized world. That becomes a challenge. So yes, when it's at primary school, it's much easier because it's basic. But as you go up the tertiary ladder, so it becomes more complicated because you are now having to use and develop expressions and terminology which are used internationally. And then you have to prepare someone for the outer world. And therefore, even if you have been able to be taught in your own language all the relevant expressions, but when you go out to the rest of the world where they don't speak your language, you're stuck. So I think that's why there's probably a leaning towards the languages which are taught internationally, like English, in that regard. So I was just pointing out those challenges. But at the same time, we encourage in Botswana culture, our traditions, that even if it's outside the school environment, if people want to, and we had, we had during my time, we encouraged competitions of cultural performances and traditions where people would speak, people would sing in their own languages, because you couldn't necessarily achieve that in the school curriculum. But we are not trying by any means to wipe out, like the Chinese are doing, your identity and your mother tongue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. Actually, that is Africa's reality. Hence, I simplify myself by using the word, the economy of languages, because a lot of things are in play here. And colleagues, let me say this, there will be a further webinar for us to unpack these realities, because the issues of language are just so complex. Hence, Charlotte will mention about the question of terminologies that speaks to the state of development of some of these African languages. But notwithstanding, as His Excellency has highlighted, African languages are very important because they are our identity. They tell us who we are. Charlotte, if you have a thought on Tulani's inquiry, please, you may have the floor to address the question of Tulani, if you don't mind. Are you there?
I'm sorry. Can you rephrase that? I didn't know it.
Yeah. Tulani says the essence of modern language and how can this language be preserved when lots of African countries have been colonized. I'm sure he's also looking at the dynamics of the colonization, the coloniality. What do you think? Because of course, one of the ways that you can preserve something is by using that thing. I'm just saying.
Yes. Let me go back to the point that I've mentioned. I said that, you know, I've realized something in regards to the issue of these languages, our African languages. They're just being, you know, deemed as, you know, minority languages because of that decolonization. The thing is, we lack terminology. That's the problem. We lack terminology, and you realize that in those several languages, if there's lack of terminology like that, people tend to lose interest. Some, they cannot really express themselves freely or fully or natively or proficiently in those languages because of this lack of terminology. And we find ourselves, you know, competing with these other languages such as, you know, English, though we do not have those terms. So it becomes complex again to preserve these languages. And in this regard, as I was suggesting that, especially looking at the South African context, perhaps if we can, this language boards like PenSALB and, you know, the provincial language policies to come up with, you know, the agencies that can collaborate to compile a terminology list in all the spheres or the public domains that can be used in preservation of these languages. The terminology list looking at the subjects being, you know, taught at primary level, perhaps terminology list of, you know, natural science or agriculture, you know, that would help. That would really help.
Thank you so much. Hence, His Excellency will talk about, while he was ending his input, he clearly emphasized on the global implication of language, that we prepare people for the global setting, not only locally. Because 2 weeks ago, I mentioned there was a conference that I was speaking at the University of Pretoria. It was organized by one of the wings of the EU, the European Union. And one of the things that came strongly in that conference was the issue of language, especially in African universities, in terms of knowledge productions and pedagogy. And language, you know, for us as Africans and the global world it's also a means to produce or to generate knowledge, as well as it's a tool for pedagogy instructions. And as I said earlier, Ngogi wa Thiong'o says the language used is the lens through which we see the world and the implications thereof. Now, I gave an example. If a student says, I want to do a PhD in isiZulu at the University of Pretoria, you hear a lot of people be cheering that student, that this is what we want, this is the way to go. But I bet you, within the split of a second, that student will not be able to get a supervisor. That's the first challenge. Because when you develop yourself in isiZulu, basically, without you having the other languages, you know, exoglossic, whether French, English, Portuguese, Spanish, you basically prepare yourself to look inward. And everybody aspires to look outward, because greater things is happening out of local national space than what is happening elsewhere. Notwithstanding, because of time, we will have to organize another webinar to look at this issue segmentally. However, Kathleen has given given an open question to anyone. She says, is there not a parallel between Bantu education and what is being done in the autonomous regions? Meaning she's referring to the autonomous Tibet as an autonomous region. If there is anyone who has something to chip in, Dr. Giallo, if you have something to say, and Godup, if you have something to say, this is the time you may want to say something. What I will say is,
yes, I wanted to add some of the contact.
All right, proceed.
In order to support the kids to learning their mother tongue well, and the priority, the work should be the developing the child literacy. Child literacy based on the village knowledge. I have done this many years ago. So I produced a 2 book that's based on local practical knowledge. That's kids, students, and their parents received well for a moment. I think it's 2000, around 2000. I produced the child literacy book based on the collecting the oral history from grade 1 to grade 6, grade 1 to 3, and 4 to 6. That was bit successful. And that, for example, when we distribute that book to the school, and then parents try to borrow the book from their kids, say, wow, this is what we wanted to see, this is what we wanted you to learn. And then that's increased the student attendance. At that time, we had a little bit of space to do that, but unfortunately, after a while, they banned those books, and the policy turned completely different. For example, now they banned those books, they banned all the mother tongue education, and then they banned, also, they shut down the higher education institution where I was teaching there before. For example, Northwest University for Nationality, there's a Tibetan Language and Culture Department. It's shut down now. In September 2020. For example, from age 4 to 6 kids, keep them in the boarding preschool, and then top from the shutting down the higher education institution. How can you imagine the both where it feel like in the air cage? There's no space, no hope to develop or any chance to reverse the policy. Yeah. So the experience of the developing child literacy based on village practical knowledge is very important, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Giallo. Yes, we all agree. I mean, especially when it has to do with the building of cognitive resonance, mother tongue is very important in that process. However, like Kathleen mentioned about the parallelity between Bantu education, what's going on in the autonomous region in Tibet. However, Kathleen, my opinion, and I speak on the correction, I want to say that Bantu education in South Africa only took place under apartheid. And apartheid as a form of oppression, it's similar to what is going on in Tibet, because Tibet is a nation on its own that was invaded. However, the invasion is already a dynamic of a different form of apartheid occurring in a different space. And if you understand what, I don't know whether I should say the logic and illogic behind oppression, is that because of the essence and importance of language and how it is used to develop human capabilities, governments that are oppressive government use it in different ways. Hence, you find, like Dr. Giallo will talk about policies that come to eradicate all the various attempts to build Tibetans through their mother language, their mother tongue, and so on and so forth, because that's just what oppression does. So I believe that one could say it's parallel in this context. Colleagues, because of time, I will just give few seconds to our two speakers to give us a closing remark. Then we will bring in Godu Doje to give us a closing remark, a general closing remark. In the course of time, we will come back on this webinar. I'm going to segment what we have discussed. We will look at various aspects in the issues of language, mother tongue, and so on and so forth, because it's a complex terrain, like His Excellency President Yen Kama clearly mentioned. You know, it's not something that we can just have 1 hour to have a satisfactory conversation, because the dynamics are intricately intertwined. You know, I mean, you teach English to have an income that you pay your bills to take care of yourself and live a happy life. And then at the time, you also need to express yourself in your mother tongue. That is your organic identity. That is the real you. So we will definitely look at how we can go about this, such that at the end we can be able to advise our policymakers and so on, especially when the government in Botswana will come in favor of His Excellency Yen Kama. We may also advise on policy issues, because Botswana, like Cameroon, you know, they are similar in this question of language, how it interplays in the political and economic spaces, because Cameroon has this microsome of ethnic villages and clans that are spread everywhere. In one district, you have a good number of them, such that you cannot even say that, okay, we in this area, we have this multiplicity of endogenous languages. Can we then say we take one of these languages for everybody to learn through? That will not work. So all these dynamics don't just give a complication. Charlotte, please, we have a few seconds of your closing remark, please.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. As complex as the issue of language is, I will really, close by saying that we really need to encourage mother language education, and it doesn't start with the teachers only. However, even in our homes, we really need to encourage that language, just by watching cartoons in these African languages with their kids. It's something that they can elevate their interest, and if they got the interest from home, they will take that interest to the schools when they are taught in that language.
Thank you. Dr. Giallo, your closing remark, please.
Thank you. So I would like to give a suggestion for those policymakers in those multi-ethnic social contacts. Please do not think language as a problem, rather than language as a right and the language as a resource. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ngodub. Ngodubla.
Okay, thank you so much. And first of all, I would like to thank both the speakers and all the other participants for very informative and insightful discussion. And indeed, the language policy, the education in mother language is a very, very complex. It's not a simple sort of thing, but a very complex issue, has multidimensional economic and social identity dimensions. And therefore, this discussion is very, very first sort of, I would say, is a first. I think we need to have more of this discussion. And with regard to the mother language education in Africa, and vis-a-vis what is happening in Tibet, I would say that Africa, the continent, is now free, and you have all democratic governments, and so nobody is really forcing you or the countries to to learn in particular language. It is sort of a government policy, which, of course, if it is not right, the people have the right to challenge it and change leaders. Okay, this is one side. But in case of Tibet, the important thing is that there has initial colonization of Tibet by the Chinese in 1950. There was some sort of a progress or acceptance of Tibetan language as one of the, in part with the Chinese Mandarin language. So there has been some education, at least up to the primary level. But since in 20s, in 90s and 2000s, there has been a much regression in the policy in the learning of Tibetan language, education of Tibetan, education of in mother language. There's huge regression, as Dr. Jallo has highlighted. So, and since last few years, it has been even worse than this, you know. And but Tibetan wanted to really learn in their language, because the language we said that it's the basis for the compassion culture, or we say Avalokiteshvara civilization. That is the basis of the Tibetan language. Is the basis of the compassionate Tibetan civilization, or we say Avalokiteshvara civilization, that is in the Tibet region, also the surrounding Bhutan, Ladakh, and Mongolia. So the death of, or you say endangerment of the Tibetan language will be a great loss to the human civilization and world heritage, because that language contains a huge resources for the benefit of the world. And we are saying that this is not for us. The world needs to give it, because in this sort of a turbulent world, chaos and crisis ridden, a substantial contribution can be given or provided by the values, or you can say the resources that is contained in the Tibetan language. So the China is now hell-bent on erasing the Tibetan language, because in Tibet Autonomous Region, they have sort of forced these children from age 3 to 4 in the Mandarin school education, in the preschool, you know. So of course, primary school, secondary school, high school, there's no doubt about that. But even in the, you can imagine in the preschool crèche level, they are forcing the children to in the Mandarin, you know. So the children actually alienate from their culture. They find that, oh, my parents are not uneducated. They lose their respect to their culture, because what they learned is Mandarin, and they say, oh, and so the interaction between the parent and children is also weakened. So there's a huge, and it is the Tibetan want to learn it. Any sort of private initiatives to teach the language and culture during the winter breaks by the monastery are even discouraged. And anybody that language advocates, you know, trying to fight within the system, also imprisoned. So this is a very, very serious issue in Tibet through the Chinese policy. And therefore, we need to do something about that. And we, through this discussion, very, very insightful and very, very fruitful discussion that we had today, I think this will sort of roll out another wave of discussion, so that the Chinese policy maker, and even in Africa also, because it's so important. I mean, we are not saying that the whole education should be throughout in the mother language, but at least in the primary level, it's important to have education, at least in the sort of social science and mathematics in your mother, because that provides a better comprehension. With this, I would like to thank so much Arta and to speaker and His Excellency Ellen Kama for your very, very intervention, very useful and very, very forceful intervention on this discussion, and Kathleen for participating, and all other viewers and listeners for your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Godupla. Kathleen just dropped a provocation on a, let me just see what she says, so that I don't ignore her. She's an important person to our movement. She says, on a very human level, as a mother, I cannot imagine my 4-year-old being abducted by the state and forced to learn another language in a boarding school. Exactly, Kathleen, that's our sentiment. And that's why we do the work, the things we do. Because, I mean, it's like, you are taking the child's humanity in a very early age. You're trying to build zombies out of human beings because you are building them on the basis of a political ideology and propaganda, which is not right. However, colleagues, because of time factor, we will come back to talk about this question of language. We will segment it. And let me highlight something. We as Africans should also be looking at opportunities to preserve and promote our languages outside classroom. We must not ignore that. Now, there is someone I follow a lot on social media. That person is His Excellency Ian Kama. He is someone who is so in touch with his culture. You see the various episodes of cultural activities, including language, packages that he promotes in his private space. And that is something that we must not lose sight, because one of the things why even our African leaders are not so much into, mother tongue and native languages is because, exoglossic languages have really transformed a lot of them metaphysically, that they don't think as people that belong to communities, but they think as people that belongs to metropolitan environment, which we will then look at it. I want to thank everyone that has participated in this webinar this afternoon. I enjoy the conversation, the dynamics brought in by Dr. Jialuo, which I thank, and Miss Charlotte, Dr. Tobi, and all the complexity that involves in language. And they are just real, they are in front of us. But notwithstanding, we will have to continue to join force to resist the language genocide that is taking place in the Tibetan region because of the political ideology of the CCP. Language, as Charlotte mentioned, is us, it's our life. There is nothing wrong in expressing oneself with multiplicity of languages. And as Kathleen mentioned, how horrible it is to take a child at the age of 4 and to lock the child in a boarding school because you are trying to construct beyond hypnotizing a human being, trying to create Chinese out of a Tibetan, which is something very impossible, because even God has endowed us with that freedom and liberty to express ourselves and to choose especially what we want and who we are in life. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say we call it off today. You will receive invitation from us again for such conversation. Elizabeth, thank you for your time. I know load shedding is announcing soon, is what we are struggling with, dealing with in South Africa, but notwithstanding, we trust the government will do something in that regard. Have a great time, a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Jello,